Thank you, Mr. Blakey, and welcome to Sabbath Services, everyone. And I'd like to welcome everyone also on Zoom. All right, everyone, I want you to pretend that you were given a choice between two options, change or die. Pretend this is not some hyperbole, but it is a decision you need to make. It's a matter between life and death. If you change, then you will live. But if you don't change, you will die, and you will die soon. Would you be able to change? This scenario I just stated is from a book titled Change or Die, written by Alan Deutschman. In his book, he looks at 3 actual events that took place where people had to change or they would die, or in one case, the company's plant would die. In one event, the first event, he talks about how studies have shown that relatively a small percentage of the population consumes the vast majority of the healthcare budget. In other words, like a very small percentage consumes 80% of the healthcare budget for diseases that can be controlled by how that patient takes care of himself, by controlling 5 behavioral issues. In other words, they're smoking, they're drinking, overeating, too much stress, and not enough exercise. If they could just control those behaviors, they would control their health. There are patients in hospitals whose arteries are so clogged that even a long walk hurts them. In fact, it hurts them to do almost any kind of physical activity. So the surgeons do a surgery we call a miracle in today's world, where they take a vein from your leg and they put it near the heart so the blood can bypass the blocked artery. But this is only a temporary fix. You see, the doctors tell the patients after the surgery that they are fixed, but they still need to stop smoking, they need to stop drinking, stop overeating, start exercising, and do something to relieve your stress, like take some yoga. But if you don't, the doctor tells them, if you don't do this, you will be back for more surgery, and eventually you will die from this disease. The vast majority of patients, of these heart patients, never change their lifestyle. They eventually die from the disease because they never changed. However, a doctor by the name of Dr. Dean Ornish does not believe that patients can change. He does not believe that patients cannot change. He believes patients can change. He recruited in a study 194 patients who were suffering severely from clogged arteries. And they would have gotten by with the bypass surgery. But instead, they chose an option to live together with other heart patients just like them whose arteries are clogged up. They had group conversations twice a week. They took classes in mediation, relaxation, yoga, and aerobic exercises. And this became their daily routine, day in and day out. Dr. Ornish studied them after 3 years after the program had ended and found that 77% of the patients actually stayed with their changed lifestyle, where it has now become a habit of how they were living. They actually changed. This was so dramatic that not only did they avoid the need for heart surgery, they reversed the progress of their heart disease. In other words, they got healthier without even getting surgery. The medical establishment states that only 1 in 10 people can change their lifestyle, but in this study, 8 out of 10 changed. 80% change, as opposed to only 10% from the medical establishment has said. Can we take these same lessons and apply it to our physical and spiritual lives? In the second event, psychologists and criminologists believe criminals cannot change their lives. A study by the Justice Department in 2002 found that 67.3% of former inmates were rearrested within 3 years. These professionals do not believe criminals can ever be changed, rehabilitated, in other words. Criminals are thought to be psychopaths. However, in San Francisco, an entire city block has a huge, large luxury condominium complex that is owned by the Delancey Street Foundation. They house criminals that have mostly been labeled as psychopaths. But these criminals live, they eat, and they work together. They move there only after committing felonies and have serious problems with drug addictions. They are usually a 3rd generation of their families who have known only poverty, crime, and drug addiction. But these criminals also are all race groups living together. They're blacks, whites, Latinos, and would you believe it, even neo-Nazis. But the felons run the place themselves without any guards or supervisions. The place even makes a profit by these felons running the place themselves. Any resident there who uses drugs of violence or threats gets kicked out immediately, but after their 4-year program is up, after they graduate into society, 60% of the people who enter this program sustain productive lives on the outside and they never go back to prison. How does that happen? How does 60% in this program never go back to prison, but the Justice Department study says 67% get rearrested within 3 years? Can we take some lessons from this and apply to our physical and spiritual lives? In the final scenario, GM had a plant in Fremont, California. The workers and the management look at each other with hostility. Beer bottles were always littering the parking lot. 20% of the employees wouldn't show up on any given day. They did not trust each other. Management and employees did not trust each other at all. There were a lot of defects on the cars coming out of that plant. The plant was considered the worst plant GM had because of all the defective cars that came out of it. It was so bad that GM eventually closed the plant because they said, this is impossible. You can't trust these employees. They're never going to change. So they closed the plant. Well, then comes Toyota. Toyota came along and they entered in a partnership with GM to take over the plant and start producing a Chevrolet car. GM's real reason for entering a partnership with Toyota was to see what new technology they have that they can use to make their cars better. When Toyota took over the plant, the UAW insisted Toyota hire back its employees that were laid off. Then something strange happened. 3 months after the plant reopened, cars were rolling out without hardly any defects. At a time when GM was celebrating in the 1980s, if they only had 25 defects per car, the plant started producing cars with no defects, none. The absenteeism rate went down from 20% to 2%. The workers took pride in their jobs. So, what did GM do? They sent spies to the plant to find out what new technology Toyota was employing. Oh, much to their surprise, they were using the same technology in the 1980s that they used back in the 1950s. Nothing changed there. Instead, they found the workers thought of themselves as family. How did they change, and what lessons can we learn and apply to our physical and spiritual lives? Did you notice what all 3 scenarios had in common? No one thought they would change. Everyone doubted them. The doctors doubted the heart patients would change. The psychologists doubted the criminals would change. GM management doubted the workers would change. So what is the secret sauce to help all of them change? Is this biblical, the secret sauce? And can we use it to change our lives around and how we live in our physical and spiritual lives? Well, before we look at part of how to change, we need to first look at what does not work. What tactic did the doctors try to use on their patients to get them to change? What tactic does society use on criminals to get them to change their behavior? What tactic did GM use on their employees? I'll tell you what that tactic is. It's fear. They scare them. Doctors tell the patients, if you don't change your lifestyle, you will die. What do the patients do when they're confronted with fear? They may change for a little while, but eventually they just go back to their old habits. What does society tell criminals? If you don't change your behavior, you're going to prison for a long time. What do? They go back to prison. They don't get scared. What do companies tell employees if they don't change? They tell them you'll be fired and you'll never work here again. And what happens? They don't change and they get fired. What does the Bible say about this fear tactic? Well, let's look at a perfect example of this when God warned Pharaoh to let Israel go, or God would send plagues to Egypt. Every time God sent a plague to Egypt, Pharaoh said he would let Israel go only to change his mind later after the plague had subsided. It finally came to a head with the 10th and final plague, and this was the death of the firstborn. You can turn with me if you want to Exodus chapter 12 and verses 29, and we'll read this, what happened on the last plague, 29 to 33, about how fear did not work with Pharaoh. Exodus 12 and verse 29. Moses writes, "And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead." So Pharaoh got scared. What did he do? In verse 31, "Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'Rise and go out from amongst my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone. Bless me also.' And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, 'We shall all be dead.'" Can you tell what's going on here? Pharaoh and the Egyptians are all afraid. They're so afraid that they're telling Israel not to just leave. They're saying, here, go, and we'll give you everything, and tell the Lord to bless me also on your way out. That's how afraid they were of God. But then things change. A couple chapters later, in Exodus chapter 14, in verses 8 and 9. Exodus chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. And Moses wrote, "And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen, his army, and he overtook them, camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth before Baal-zephon." As you can tell, Pharaoh changed, only temporary. Fear changed him only for a second. He went back to his old self. He decided to pursue the children of Israel. Fear did not work on Pharaoh. We also see other instances in the Bible where fear did not work. Look at the children of Israel. They were going through the wilderness. They rebelled. God put a plague on them. They repented. This happened over and over again until finally God had enough and said, "That's it. You're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness." Even after Israel became a kingdom, they still did evil in God's sight, and God punished them more and more until eventually they went back to their old selves, and then he finally had them taken captive. So as you can tell from this message, fear does not work in any human being. It did not work on anyone in the Bible either. So let's get to the meat of this message now. How can we change? What lessons can we take from these three scenarios and apply it in our lives to live a better physical and spiritual life? What is that secret sauce that we can look at in the Bible to help us change? Well, if the first part left you hungry for more, don't worry. There's a part 2 coming up in the next sermonette, Change or Die, part 2. Have a wonderful Sabbath.